The psychology of humanity is something that has intrigued us forever, you know? Why do we think the way that we think? Why do we laugh? Why do we cry? Why do we hate? Why are we happy? Why do we fall in love? Why do we scream? Why am I afraid of women? These questions, and many like them, have been asked over and over and over again. And oftentimes there are pretty conflicting answers on why we feel these ways from different research studies and different experiments. And in this video, I want to go over what I think is genuinely the most disturbing, abhorrent, terrible experiment and group of experiments that has ever been done in psychological history that we know of. I want to go over its backstory, its findings, the experiments themselves, and the man behind these demented things. In this video, I will be diving into the deep and depressing background of Harry Harlow and his disturbing experiments on monkeys in an attempt to find the cure for depression in humans. From the pit of despair to the Iron Maiden to the rack. This video will be a deep dive into the messed up psyche and the events that unfolded because of it, of Harry Harlow. Viewer discretion is advised. This stuff is gonna get crazy. I'm not gonna go too overboard with it because I do like having a YouTube channel. I don't want it to get deleted, so I'm gonna be telling you the facts, the details to the best of my ability, without making it too gory, but the themes are still gonna be there. So if you're squeamish around, experiments on animals and monkeys and that kind of thing, you probably shouldn't watch. All right, with all that said, let's dive headfirst into the study of depression in monkeys and men. So to fully understand the experiments and the horror of these experiments that Harry Harlow conducted, we need to take it all the way back to the time period and the mental state of the average person when this was all happening. It may come as no surprise to many of you watching, but major depressive disorder is the most prevalent mood disorder in the United States of America. And this was also the case way back in the 1950s. Even way back then, the mid-1900s, psychologists were looking for ways to counteract and fight major depressive disorder. They were trying to figure out medicines and techniques and torture methods, pretty much, to get people out of these depressive snaps, and many of these people would go to crazy lengths to try to find those cures. Psychologist Harry Harlow being one of them. Harry Harlow's mission was as benevolent as it can be on the surface. He wanted to find the cure to depression. Now, as we know today, there's no outright cure yet. If there probably is, Big Pharma just has it. Anyways, he wanted to find an actual medicine or a way or a treatment to fix it. Harry Frederick Harlow was an American psychologist in the mid-1950s. He was born on Halloween night in 1905. And yes, I'm not making that up. The psychologist that carried out these horrible Frankenstein-esque experiments was born on Halloween night. The jokes write themselves. He got his bachelor's and his PhD in experimental psychology from Stanford University in California, a very prestigious school, and his life was decently normal. Now, it wasn't fully normal, it was decently normal. Straight out of the gates of graduation, he began to teach at another university named the University of Wisconsin-Madison, or WM, as I'm going to be referring to it as from now on. When he got to WM, he began to realize that he needed something, a controlled habitat of sorts, in order to carry out experiments. The subject of Harlow's experiments would be very widely known now, but back in the day, it was pretty decently cutting edge. He wanted to use monkeys in his experiments because he himself believed, these monkeys share a lot of similar traits, a lot of DNA, and a lot of behavioral things that humans do. So if we experiment on monkeys, we can kind of get the reasoning for humans, why they do things, and maybe even develop treatments for human sicknesses, and in this case, depression. So right after starting at WM, he acquired funding to build this state-of-the-art primate laboratory prison. Harlow's main interest in these monkeys was to see firsthand how they responded to stress factors, abandonment, long periods of isolation, and changes in environment. And he wanted to be able to see all this up close, and that's why he didn't conduct them in the wild, because the wild isn't a controlled area, but his little lab thing is a controlled area. Now, right off the bat there, the red flags are popping up like daisies, right? He wants to build this laboratory away from people so he can put monkeys in isolation and these strange, weird, twisted environments for long periods of time and study how that behavior affects them. It's kind of weird, but this is the mid-1900s. There's some other weird stuff happening across the pond, if you know what I'm talking about. People probably didn't bat an eye. You know, they were probably just like, yeah, you go, Harry Harlow. You're kind of weird, but you go. Now, Harry Harlow himself also suffered several bouts of depression in his own personal life. He was, at times, very mentally unwell, but at times, very mentally stable. I mean, he has a PhD, and he's a professor at a college, so he had to be somewhat capable. During some parts of his life, he was very, very mentally unwell. I tell you about his struggles with mental health because I do want the light to be shown on the fact that he might have started these experiments to genuinely find the cure, or in his own mind, he wanted to cure depression. As he experienced it firsthand, he knows, millions of other people do. He wanted to fix it. Were his methods bad? Yes, but were his intentions good? We don't know. That's up to you to decide. You'll see what I mean when you keep watching. In 1932, Harlow married his first wife. Her name was Clara Mears, and he had 2 children with her. Harry and Clara would end up getting divorced a few years later in 1946. Harlow then remarried a child psychologist named Margaret Quinney, and then also had 2 kids with her. And it was around the time of Harlow's first marriage to Clara when he realized that he needed to build that primate enclosure to study these apes close up. And in the year 1932, he did that. He constructed it. He did it himself. He hired people to. The lab was created, and he needed to decide on what kind of ape to use. He, of course, settled on the famous rhesus monkey, specifically the macaques. These poor monkeys were, of course, oblivious to the horrible treatment and the torment that they would end up facing, and their children as well, specifically, would end up facing in the coming years. So this is your last chance to click off this video if you get squeamish from animal experiments or something like that. I'm giving you your last warning. If you don't do it, it's not my fault, okay? So I've given you the backstory of Harry Harlow, why he's doing the things that he's doing, why he wants to use monkeys, why he's making this lab, why these things are being implemented. Now we need to get into the actual experiments themselves, and we need to deduce and go into all the horrific details and the nasty details of them. This is a mentally ill man who has suffered bouts of depression in his own life, a man who is, married and divorced twice, a man who seemingly really wants to find the cure for depression and is willing to go to lengths that we might find weird to do so. I'm not taking up for him, but he does have the reasoning, but there is no reasoning in the world that could suffice and cover up what he actually does. And let's get into those horrible experiments right now. The first experiment that I want to go over is possibly his most famous. It's the Iron Maidens, or the fake caregivers, or the surrogate mothers. Those are the 3 things. He, of course, being the mentally ill man that he was, called them Iron Maidens, which, yes, that is not only a band, that is a medieval torture device. A medieval torture device. Anyways, the Iron Maidens. The experiment went like this. He would put a monkey in a box with 2 different options in front of it. These options were, of course, mothers that it would choose from, because those monkeys were stripped away from their mothers when they were just real small, like a few days old, were taken away from their real mothers, put in this box, and forced to choose between one of these 2 fake moms. One of these moms was created out of wire, mesh kind of, and wood sticks. This fake mom dispensed food through a piece in its chest in the form of milk. So, the baby's got to eat. It's going to go to this wire mesh wooden mom thing and eat the milk from its chest. It doesn't know any better. The other mom was made out of a much, much softer material that was kind of like felt and fabric. This mom is obviously more soft and warm and cuddly than the wire mesh and wooden mom. See, that's the entire experiment. Harry Harlow wanted to see if these baby monkeys would choose the mother that provided them with food, but also was less comfortable to be around, over a mother that was more comfortable in caregiving, like the cloth was. Would they pick that one, or the one that gave them food? The monkeys themselves seemed to prefer the mother made out of the cloth material because it was more soft and caressing when they would latch onto it, meaning that the monkeys would naturally choose warmth and affection over food, which I guess is a decent finding for an experiment. This is pretty normal of an experiment so far. It's pretty basic. The monkeys would choose safety and comfort over just sheer food. Of course, this experiment didn't just last, a few days or a few weeks or something like that, and then the monkeys were given back to their mothers. No, this lasted months to a year, actually. Baby monkeys were again taken from their mothers, put in these boxes, and raised to adolescence by these fake moms that would produce food or not. Once the Iron Maidens experiment was complete, the monkeys were then tested and put back with each other, and they had very strange effects in their psyche and their mental stability. They showed weird behaviors like walking around and then falling down, or hitting themselves in the face, or jumping off of tables with their head first. There's these weird, unnatural movements that a monkey would never do, or any creature. Like, they wanted to hurt themselves. They wouldn't interact with each other because they were so used to having, a still fake mom. They were kind of freaked out by the presence of other monkeys, and just overall, very weird findings. I'll touch into some deeper parts of this experiment later on in the video, and some more additions that Harlow did, but that was the end of the Iron Maidens for the first test. Now I want to talk to you all about maybe the most infamous experiment he did, named the Pit of Despair. This is not going to be good, okay? With the general success of the Iron Maidens behind him, Harlow wanted to move on to more rigorous testing to see if he could simulate depression and scenarios that involve depression in these monkeys, these baby, helpless monkeys. That's when he came up with the bright idea for the Pit of Despair. The pit was constructed like this. A small cone-shaped structure made out of cold metal was built. The bottom of the cone structure had a mesh floor, which means that fecal matter and excrement could flow down without the monkeys having to be removed. The top of this cone was obviously wide, and it was kind of built, just like this. The floor was a small square area, and the monkey would then be placed inside this cone like that, completely cut off from the outside world. They were given food and they were given water, but save for that, they had no experience and no contact with anything outside of the cold steel walls of the pit. They would be left alone for weeks and months at a time, up to years at a time. And again, Harlow was doing this to simulate what it feels like to be depressed. He believed that depression felt like you were trapped inside of a metal box and you couldn't see past the edges of the box. So he was trying to simulate that using the pit. Once this experiment was complete, the months after it started, Harlow began to extract the monkeys from the cones and see and deduce what happened and how they're going to behave. Except there was one problem. Most of the monkeys that were put into the cone would just collapse and lay in a ball after like the third or fourth day of being inside the cone. They couldn't stand anymore. They wouldn't stand anymore. They wouldn't scream for help. They wouldn't claw at the sides. They would just lay down in a ball and whimper alone in the Pit of Despair cone. They were completely unresponsive to stimuli like toys and noises and games, and they would just lay motionless all day and all night, except to eat and to drink. They had no ambition, no goals, no playful happiness that normal baby monkeys have. They were alone, and they were obviously depressed. The experiment was working, according to Harry Harlow. The first checkup of these monkeys was 30 days after it started, and he released the monkeys from the cones to play with each other. He wanted to see how they would interact just 30 days, only a month after they were put in the Pit of Despair. He wanted to see how it changed them. Sadly and unfortunately, the results are as you would expect. The victims of the pit for those 30 days were unable to go back and revert to normal social behavior. They wouldn't play with monkeys. They wouldn't talk. They wouldn't vocalize. They wouldn't run. Most of them, in fact, would just walk a few steps and lay down in that same ball that they were inside of the cone. They would just lay out on the table in that ball. Even though they had the opportunity to run around and play with monkeys and be a little baby monkey for once, they didn't. They chose to curl up in a ball and lay down. The Pit of Despair broke the monkeys, physically and mentally both. These behaviors would last for months and even up to a year in some cases. However, towards the end of that year, some of the monkeys began to turn back to normal. They kind of developed social cues more. They started to get more and more happy, and just being out of the pit for that long kind of got them back together, but none of the monkeys fully went back to normal. None of them fully adapted to normal life. Which, to me, yeah, I don't need an experiment to prove that, right? If I put something in a box and deprive it from anything except food and water for 30 days, especially as a baby, it's gonna be sad and depressed. That's an obvious thing. That doesn't require doing the actual experiment, to me at least. That should be pretty obvious. I digress. At the time of these experiments, in the late 30s and 40s and 50s, critics and environmentalists and animal rights activists were obviously in a tussle. They were not happy about Harry Harlow subjecting these monkeys to fake moms and putting them in pits and isolating them in solitary confinement and making them depressed. They weren't happy about it. One literary critic named Wayne Booth was quoted as saying, "Harry Harlow and his colleagues go on torturing their non-human primates decade after decade, invariably proving what we all already knew in advance, that social creatures can be destroyed by destroying their social ties." End quote. Which I'm like, yeah, Wayne is right. To me, that's like obvious. We already knew that. You take a social animal, you take the social part away from it, it's just a depressed, sad animal. That shouldn't require these vigorous tests. But Harry Harlow thought they did. And to make matters worse, Harlow didn't even try to hide from the criticism. He didn't try to shake it off. He didn't try to slap it back or take up for what he's doing.
Well, what do you mean by saying that a baby loves its mother? Certainly one thing we mean is that it gets a great feeling of security in the presence of the mother. Now, Mr. Collingwood, wouldn't you say that if you frightened a baby, that it went running to its mother, was comforted, and then all the fear disappeared and was replaced by a complete sense of security?
In 1974, in an interview, he was quoted as saying, "The only thing I care about is whether the monkeys will turn out a property I can publish. I don't have any love for them. Never have. I really don't like animals. I despise cats. I hate dogs. How could you like a monkey?" End quote. You could probably see where this Harlow dude's coming from. He has no empathy for animals, no love for them. So he's the person that would do this. He would shove these very smart, intelligent creatures into these pits and these fake environments and raise them there for months and years at a time, and somehow think the results are profound, even though it should have been obvious. So those are the first two major experiments that Harry Harlow is known for: the Iron Maidens and the Pit of Despair. Both of which are obviously very depressing, very sad, and I just feel really bad for the monkeys that were in there, shoved in a tiny cold box, forced to just stay there for months. That's sad. That's really sad, actually. Wow. After the Pit of Despair, Harlow wanted to revert back to his origins with the Iron Maidens. He wanted to see how he could improve and expand the stimulus and the motherly design of these fake surrogate mothers. So that's just what he did. The hardwood and mesh mother and the cloth mother, that wasn't enough. He wanted to make other mothers to see how they would work. He introduced another version that would actually physically rock back and forth and cradle a newborn monkey. He would subject monkeys to this mom, and they would obviously pick that one because it moved and cradled them. Then after he would put the monkey in for that day, he would take it out and he would let it have 30 minutes of social time. The batch that was exposed to these cradling mothers, they got the 30 minutes of playtime, they turned out pretty normal. It seems like they were raised decently right. They didn't have any weird self-harm features like those other ones from the pits or the other surrogate mothers, and they didn't seem depressed. They seemed decently normal, which again, obviously, if you get cradled and hugged and then let out for 30 minutes a day, you're going to be more social. You're not going to be depressed like you would be in a box. Another Iron Maiden was constructed that would have spikes that could retract in and out and stab the monkeys. Now, it wasn't like an outright sword stab, but it was a hard poke, obviously, and no baby wants to be poked. Other maidens would have cold air blasts come out of their face, and other ones would drench the baby with water, freezing cold water. And all of these stimulus were put there to see if the babies would keep going back to that mother even though it was hurting them. And the very sad answer is yes. These poor, helpless little monkey babies would go back to these moms that would literally stab them and shoot cold water on them and blow really forceful air in their faces. Even though they would jump back, they would scream, they would cry, they would still go back to that fake mom, even though it was hurting them, because that's all they knew. Because Harry Harlow put them in the situation where they had no other motherly or parental figure. They had to go back to the very thing that was hurting them. That's very distressing and saddening to think, I know, and that's why I genuinely believe these are some of the worst experiments ever done. And what's even more sad is the real-life implications that these experiments prove. Because These things happen in real life. And no, your mom doesn't stab you or blow cold air on you or pour freezing water on you, but abuse in homes and in children still happen to this day. And the sad truth is, even though some parents abuse their children, the children have to go to the parents, go back to them, and stay with them because that's all they know. Just like the monkeys in this situation, even though they were getting hurt, they had to go back to that parent. They had to, because that was the only thing that kept them grounded in reality, the only thing that they knew existed. And despite the fact that they were getting tortured pretty much, they would cling to these fake moms with every last breath while getting stabbed and spiked and cold water poured on them and air blown on them. They would screech, they would cry, but they would still hold on to the fake moms. However, even after these awful experiments, these poor monkey sufferings had just begun. After the Iron Maidens, after the Pit of Despair, and those type of things, another experiment was thought of by Harry Harlow to see how these monkeys that were subjected to those experiments would be as parents. He wanted to see how they would raise their own kids after being grown up in a terrible situation, after being stuck in the pit, after being exposed to these fake moms. How would these monkeys behave as actual parents? And he wanted to see firsthand how they would. The only problem is the monkeys that he was using for this experiment were the depressed and socially awkward and anxious ones that he put in the Pit of Despair and the ones that he put with the Iron Maidens. These monkeys were very mentally broken and mentally unhealthy, and he was trying to get them to mate with each other when they wouldn't even talk to each other or communicate at all. And I know monkeys can't talk. I'm just saying talk because that's how I guess they do talk, yeah. But of course they're not going to reproduce with each other. They're depressed. You just left them in a cold box for 3 months. You gave them a fake mom that stabbed them. Of course they're going to be depressed. But how does Harry Harlow go about fixing this? These monkeys that won't interact? No, he doesn't do the normal thing and get maybe new monkeys to breed to see how they would act. No, he creates another device to force these monkeys to breed with each other. He built a device named the rack, which is what I'll be calling it, but there is an explicit in the middle of that I cannot say, the blank rack. And Harry Harlow himself came up with that name. That's not a pseudonym or a name given by us today. He made it the rack, okay? And I guess you can see where it's going based on what it's meant for. The rack's sole purpose was to bind these female monkeys, which had already been experimented on with the Pit and the Iron Maidens, down to the floor. He tied them down to where they couldn't move. He then would release the male monkeys in a very tight, confined cage with these tied down female monkeys, and you can see where it would go from there. After this awful experiment, 20 monkeys got pregnant and gave birth, except it was awful. Horrifyingly, the mothers hated their children. Most of them either abused them or abandoned them or tried to throw them off of tables. And the ones who didn't do that were indifferent and they weren't there and they were depressive and they had no real connection with the child they just gave birth to. They kind of just were like tapping it, just like, I don't really like you. They had no passion. They had no motherly drive. Out of all the monkeys that Harlow used, only 5 of them were deemed adequate enough to be mothers and to raise a child. And again, this is because those monkeys that were raising the children were the ones that were subjected to the Pit of Despair and the Iron Maidens. It is not a surprise that they acted this way. We did not need this experiment to see that this would happen this way. That's all I'm saying. Harlow then would go on to do several other experiments, including monkeys and not with monkeys, all of them reaching varying levels of success. Again, critics and animal rights activists were obviously not happy that he was doing these experiments with these monkeys, so they would always try to get him shut down or get his funding cut. Like that Wayne guy said earlier, many people shared that same sentiment. You don't need to do these actual experiments because we could have told you that. We could have told you depressed monkeys would come from shoving them in a box as a baby and raising them alone in solitary confinement. This whole time in Harlow's personal life, he developed a severe drinking problem. And students would often see him at local bars around the campus, drinking and getting just drunk. At the same time, he was also going through bouts of depression, a couple divorces, raising 4 children. He was a very, very messed up individual. His second wife died which probably didn't help his mental state. So he got married again to his first wife, who he already divorced, by the way. So it's just this whole thing of emotions in his head alongside these awful experiments. No, I'm not trying to take over this guy, but he was having some bad things in his life. That does not change the fact that he did horrible things to these poor, innocent creatures at all. Like, he had no business doing that in the name of science or whatever, but he did, and we can't fix it now. But it almost seemed as if these experiments mirrored his awful state of mind, his awful headspace. Harlow was diagnosed in his later years with Parkinson's disease, which of course is untreatable. And much like his lab monkeys, there was no medicine, no salvation, and no cure for this disease he was given. Now, as bad as it sounds, Harlow's experiments did actually produce some real results. One of the main ones being love from a mother or a parental figure to a child is not just about food. I mean, look at the Iron Maidens, for example. The babies chose the soft mother that didn't give as much food over the mother that produced food at any time, just because the other mother was made out of wire and hard wood. It was just a less comfortable thing. They wanted nurturing and care, and the cloth mother would give it to them. Another result is that something can love someone even if it's the thing that's hurting them. You know, the Iron Maidens were spiking and blowing and hurting the monkeys, but they would still go back every day at the end of the day and love on them because that's all they knew. Which apparently those were decently large findings in the grand scheme of things in the 1950s. I mean, wow. I mean, if that's grand, I don't know, man. Didn't we go to the moon around that time? How was that grand? What? As I mentioned earlier, Harlow did go through bouts of depression, which might have been why he didn't care about the media recognition or his career being like hated by people. Maybe he just thought that it didn't matter, or maybe he was just too depressed about it. But in a cruel twist of fate, Harlow developed this kind of fame in the scientific and psychological community about these experiments and findings, and it was this fame that drove him into this depressive spiral. It seemed that these long bouts of depression stemmed from the success that he got. Every award, every speech, every honor he was given would just give him this sense of dread and awful feeling, and it would make him bedridden for days. In 1967, at the age of 62, he was given the National Medal of Science by Lyndon B. Johnson, the then president, and this award that's a huge award. I mean, the president is giving him a medal, and he went into this massive depression because of it. Later, in April of 1968, the year after he got the award, he was checked into the Mayo Clinic for severe depression, and him being there made his headspace even worse. He wrote to a friend, "Since I disliked all or almost all of the events which the hospital arranged to fill up time, the minutes, the hours, the days, dragged on infinitely, monotonously," end quote. Harlow didn't find any of the treatments helpful. Group therapy was not helpful, electroshock therapy wasn't helpful, talking wasn't helpful, and he was just alone in a hospital room by himself with nothing but the heart monitor making sound for days at a time. That almost sounds like what he did to the monkeys in the pit of despair. Nothing was working for him, so he opted to try a harsher form of electroshock therapy to see if somehow that would fix his depression. After the treatments, Harlow was in decent spirits about his condition. It was kind of making him better, but it's unsure if it was the actual treatments or if he was just finally getting out of the bout of depression. We don't know. After the electroshock therapy ended, again, a quote from a note he wrote says, "I am convinced that my own treatment gave me transient help. It made the early days of hospitalism more endurable." End quote. Bro, I'm convinced I cured myself. Brother, what are you talking about right now? He's literally the king of Yappington, dog. After 59 days in the Mayo Clinic, he was released. In Harlow's journal after he was released, another quote about his life was found. "There may be some forms of mental illness in which the staff or family suffer more than the patient, but I doubt that this can be true when the patient is in a deep depression and one assumes that the staff and family are not themselves critically ill at the time. One of my few motivations to recover during the darkest hours was to have a chance to tell the world how deeply the patient has suffered. I hope to partially recover so that I will tell the world about the agonies that a depressed person undergoes. I can say that the mental torment of depression is extreme." End quote. As you can see, he was suffering, man. He was going through it. And his experiments before he was hospitalized were just foreshadowing his own mental state. But in this weird way, Harry Harlow was almost forced to undergo similar experiments that he did to the monkeys. You know, he shocked them. He blew air on them, you know, cold water. And when he was alone in this hospital room, he was given electroshock therapy, forced to talk to people, and he was not allowed to leave. So it's kind of similar, and like this weird like karma situation here. I know that sounds bad. Like I don't want to wish anything about anybody, but I mean, pit of despair. You know, a monkey alone in a box, Harlow alone in a hospital room. You know, electroshock therapy, monkeys being shocked and water sprayed on them and that kind of thing. It's kind of the same. I don't know. Karma's kind of real. Harry Harlow would die December 6th, 1981, at the age of 76. Leaving behind his wife and 4 children. He spent his entire life trying to find the cure for depression, which is something that he himself suffered, but instead he ended up living a, quote, life within a wall of steel, end quote, that no one else can understand except people that have had depression. Harlow left behind a very complicated legacy. As I said in this video, some people adored him for his findings of abandonment and isolation in children and adolescents, and again, critics and animal rights activists hated him for doing what he did. But most people are in this like middle ground where they're like, yeah, that was really bad and that was awful, he shouldn't have done that. But also, it's weird to know that even though these things were hurting these monkeys, they would still return to their mothers, they would still try to be normal. It's a pretty weird balance. Let me know what you think in the comments below about that, by the way. And in an even sadder twist of fate, after the experiments were completed, most of the monkeys involved died due to a tuberculosis outbreak in the lab, which I guess was a sweet reprieve from any more experiments they might have gone through. Leave a like for these brave monkeys and what they had to endure. Nothing should ever have to go through something like that in their life, not even an animal, for sure. You know, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a scientist, I'm just a YouTuber who enjoys deep dives into psychology and the reasoning behind things, and this is just such a disturbing case of morality. Is it a good thing that this experiment happened? No. Is it a bad thing that this experiment happened? Have there been worse things? Yes. It's just very tough to figure out where you lie morally in these situations. You know, those findings, while they were pretty groundbreaking for the time, to me, in a modern sense, I wouldn't need to make those experiments to see that. I wouldn't need to shove a little baby into a box to see if it would get depressed. I feel like I would know that. But for that time, I guess that was groundbreaking stuff. And, you know, for that, if Harlow's legacy is just in the middle ground, that's better than being completely bad. But again, let me know your thoughts on that in the comments below. That's it for the video. Hope you all enjoyed watching till the end. I hope you enjoyed the style. Kind of like a little bit different from normal. I love doing videos like this, so I really hope you all enjoyed it too. I just love sitting down and talking about this kind of stuff. This is like a conversation me and my friends would have, and I just love that I can record this, and I really hope you all like it. So if you do, leave a like. If you watch the end of the video somehow, like, go ahead and leave a like. There's no point in watching the whole thing if you didn't like it. Unless you're a hater, which is kind of real. If you watch the whole thing and you're a hater, I kind of respect that. So leave a dislike if you're doing that. And comment below other deep dives I should do. I'm so interested in this kind of thing, and hope you are too. Thank you so much for all you do. I love and appreciate you. If you're struggling with mental health or depression, I'll leave a hotline in the description below. Remember, somebody's always there. Somebody would miss you. If you think nobody would, I promise you, the moon would know you were gone. I love you all. I'll see you in the next video. Peace and love.